Hi, I'm Chip Rogers, and welcome to the AAHOA Educational Experience. This week we'll be talking about how to succeed as a franchisee. Joining me this week are three experts in the area of franchising. We start with Robert Zarko of the law firm Zarko, Einhorn, Salkowski, and Brito. Next is Ron Gardner, and he is with Dady and Gardner. And finally, Carmen Caruso of Caruso Kaplan. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us this week. And first we'll start with Robert. So you're in a franchise, and you recall the day the franchise or salesperson came to you and they said, these are all the things that are going to happen. These are all the good things, the way we're going to support you. And yet you're recognizing these things aren't happening. You don't necessarily want to file a lawsuit. You don't want to have to begin taking legal action, but you do want to get the franchisor to do what they said they were going to do. What do you need to do, and is that something that happens quite often?
This is a situation that occurs all too frequently, unfortunately, for the franchisees. Because franchisees have expectations. When they sign franchise agreements, the franchisor or salesperson is making all sorts of representations with regard to what it is that the franchisee is going to be receiving in terms of service, support, and assistance. The first thing a franchisee should do is in the very early stage of the relationship, even before they sign the franchise agreement, when they go out and try to investigate and undertake their due diligence, they should speak to existing franchisees to see, in fact, how the relationship is between the franchisor and the franchisee, and specifically what level of service, support, and assistance is actually being provided to the franchisees as compared to what is being represented by the franchisor representative during the meetings, as well as what is set forth in the agreement. During the relationship, once the franchisee has already signed on and the relationship has started to mature, when the franchisee starts realizing that the franchisor is not living up to the representations that were made with regard to the level of service, support, and assistance that is anticipated, the franchisee needs to start documenting these situations in a very nice way, not in an adversarial way, but to write a nice letter and say, listen, you know what, I'm having this particular problem in this particular area and I would like assistance. And throughout those communications, which should be frequent, to make sure that there is a record made that when a problem arises in the future, a serious problem that cannot be remedied, that no one says, oh, you're just bringing this up now because you are unable to pay your royalty fees and now you're bringing up the fact that it's our fault. When you have a nice paper trail that supports the fact that there's a history of a problem, at that point, these communications can be helpful. The first thing you try to do is sit down with your representative from the brand. Tell them what the problem is. See what they tell you. Try to work with them. Try to make sure they understand you're trying to align your interests between yourself and the franchisor to try to improve the situation. If those efforts are unavailing and do not give you any kind of satisfaction, then I strongly suggest that you consult with a franchise attorney, and not for the purpose of immediately filing a lawsuit and creating a problem, but to guide you through the process. Perhaps they can give you certain suggestions, certain advice that would avoid a dispute, a legal dispute later. Unfortunately, there are times when all those steps are taken and there's no more choice, and then a dispute arises. But there are different steps. A lot of these franchisors have ombudsmen. Or problem solvers within their system, right, that a problem can be taken to. You can have a mediation, you can have a business meeting, and then the last resort, if it doesn't work out, is unfortunate litigation.
Ron, I want to follow up on that. It would seem like whether it's a franchisee-franchisor relationship or any business relationship, really communication is the key to making sure that relationship stays successful and stays strong. But how important is it to make sure that you are communicating? How do you communicate? And as Robert touched on, the documentation. It would seem to me that is extremely important in case, no one plans for there to be a fight, no one plans for failure, but you need to be prepared.
That's so absolutely true, and it really, I think, happens at more than one level. Besides the individual franchisee, Chip, who needs to make sure that when he's having problems, and frankly, even if it's long before a dispute, things just aren't working. Somebody told you that you were going to get visits every 2 months and you're getting visits every 8 months. Well, that may or may not make a difference in your success. But you want to be gently saying, look, this is what I was expecting. I'm not getting that, so that in the event something does go horribly wrong down the road, you've been able to, as Robert mentioned, go back and sort of point to that. So many times clients call me or come into my office and they've gotten notice after notice after notice of the franchisor that the franchisor thinks something's wrong in the relationship, and rather than deal with that conflict up front, the franchisee has decided, well, I'm just going to stick my head in the sand and sort of this will go away. It rarely does go away, and at that point you're losing the paper battle. The other piece to communication in a franchise relationship that I think is critical, besides the one-on-one communication, is making sure that the franchisee's system-wide concerns are heard. So often we see a divide and conquer strategy from the franchisors. That is, that when franchisees start complaining, or even if it's not to the level of a complaint, bringing things to the franchisor's attention, franchisors, whether it's true or not, will say to the franchisee, this is just you, we don't understand, this must be your location, it must be your manager, it must be doing something. They really tend to isolate the franchisees, and that's where a franchise association can be such a gigantic help to franchisees. When franchisees can get together in a forum where they can share their common experience, you can start understanding which issues really are yours and which issues are of a much larger system-wide or at least regional concern. It gives you the opportunity to identify those issues, and frankly, it gives you some cover in communicating to the franchisor, because like it or not, some franchisors don't want to hear that they're not doing the job, and they get belligerent or angry, and even if they don't have a tendency to do that, franchisees are reluctant to create conflict for fear that that might happen. And an association can put a buffer between the franchisee and the franchisor to bring those types of issues to the attention of the franchisor. And so if you have an association in your system, use them for communication. If you don't have an association in your system, you ought to really try and figure out how to get one for your system, because it adds this additional tool in the arsenal of the franchisees to effectuate communication about things that the franchisee might have a hard time talking directly to their franchisor about all by themselves.
And Carmen, I want to follow up on
Sure.
what he's talking about. Associations, are they important? Do they help? And if I'm a new franchisee and I've just spent all this money paying my franchisor, establishing my business, and now here comes this association that wants a little more money for me to join, is there value in doing so?
Absolutely, 100%, assuming that the association is effective and well managed and all that, but the idea of having the association is a 100% good idea. I can't think of a franchise system that would be worse off because the franchisees formed an association. And one of the things that we see, I think, is guys who try franchise cases a lot, is that these associations are often born of a crisis, where some terrible situation brings the franchisees together, they form an association, and that's unfortunate, because then the relationship with the franchisor is adversarial by definition, born out of this crisis. And often the franchisor then sees the new association as a threat, and it has to be stopped, and things like that. It's so much better to have an association, good times and bad, so that the association is the franchisor's partner in growing the brand for the benefit of everybody in the system, so that everyone's rowing in the same direction and all that. Because then when the problems do develop, when there's a rollout of a new product or a remodeling requirement, or something's wrong with the new software for the reservation system, things that affect everybody, then I think the franchisor is going to be more likely to sit down with the association leaders and work things out in a spirit of win-win, which is where everyone really wants to be. In these other in the problem cases, when the association comes together in a crisis, too often it's hard to get everyone to participate because people are afraid of sticking their necks out. They're afraid of retaliation. And then if the crisis passes, the association kind of goes away. We don't need it anymore, and that's the wrong attitude. The other thing I'd point out is that franchisees, when they bring problems to the attention of the franchisor, they really want to make sure that their own house is in order, that they are in compliance to the extent possible with their franchise agreement, so they're not giving the franchisor an opportunity to strike back. And the last thing I wanted to say about associations in particular, in Illinois, where I practice out of Chicago, we have a statute in part of our state franchise law that specifically protects the right of franchisees to associate in an independent trade association and protects them under the statute from retaliation for doing so. So that's an important thing to know, and we're not alone. Some of the states have that, but nowhere near enough, and that's what gets us into the Bill of Rights and some of the franchisee legislation that we'd all like to see happen.
I guess the real moral of that story is there are strength in numbers.
Absolutely.
And one franchisee against a big franchisor is not a good battle, but all the franchisees working together can make a big difference.
Absolutely.
Well, we need to take a quick time out. This is the AAHOA Educational Experience. We'll be back right after this. I'm Chip Rogers, and welcome back to the AAHOA Educational Experience. We're talking franchising with some experts in the field, Robert Zarko, Ron Gardner, and Carmen Caruso, all franchise attorneys. Robert, franchisees out there are facing a tough economic times, no doubt about it. What are the biggest threats to a franchisee? And if you're an existing franchisee or thinking about getting into a franchise, what are the biggest threats you're facing right now in this economy we're dealing with?
Well, dollars are few, and so are opportunities. Opportunities right now that could give you a substantial or comfortable financial return are not easy to find. Most industries have been impacted substantially, and therefore getting into franchising, like getting into any other business, is a risky venture. The biggest threat to franchisees is that franchisors may be cutting back in terms of the services that they may be offering, because they have also their own internal economic business model that they have to follow and satisfy. So they may not be able to provide the level of service, support, and assistance that existed in the past going forward during bad economic times. The second biggest threat is franchisors expecting more and requiring more and imposing more obligations on franchisees to follow programs that the franchisees perhaps would think are economically unfeasible. For instance, a franchisor may impose a maximum pricing requirement on a franchisee under the guise that they may think that that's legally unchallengeable, which is not necessarily the case. There are challenges that a franchisee can assert for those kind of measures, but they're becoming more commonplace. And when franchisees are acting on their own, without participating as part of a franchise association, those challenges become more difficult. And that's why, going back to the discussion we've had earlier with regard to the strength of franchise associations, that strength and unity, in fact, helps in a situation like that. Franchisors are also going to be requiring franchisees to invest more and expend more in their business in order to try to create the new improved look, in order to attract old sales, old customers that perhaps are tired of the same brand or the same look. Well, that requires a tremendous amount of investment by the franchisee. The franchisee in a market where you have a credit crunch, where there's not a lot of money available out there, where sales are down, therefore profits are down. There's a conflicting burden. Franchisors expecting more from the franchisee so the brand image is improved in the franchisee's business, yet the franchisee is having to fund that or finance that in the midst of a credit crisis where credit is not easily available, where sales are down and profits are down. So you have that conflict. So frankly, the biggest threat that the franchisee has right now, I think, is trying to maximize the performance of their business with the limitation of funds available, yet coupled with the maximum amount of financing being required by the franchisor to invest in the business.
Ron, Robert mentioned a few minutes ago an acronym, OPM, Other People's Money. Yes. And I think he really highlights a good point from the franchisor's standpoint. If I can require my franchisees to spend more of their own money, the value of my product increases. But from the franchisee's standpoint, they look at this and they say, well, I don't even have the resources to do what you're asking me to do. What happens in that situation? What if a franchisor comes to a franchisee and says, you need to spend $2 million remodeling your entire property? What do you do?
Well, I mean, a lot of it's going to depend on the specific situation that that franchisee is in. What state is he in? Does he have some sort of franchisee protection under the statute that the legislature has granted to him? What kind of relationship does he have with the franchisor? Is he a multiple unit owner, so he has some bargaining power with the franchisor, where, although being a multi-unit guy in that situation might just compound the issue, because maybe it's not going to cost you 2, it's going to cost you 4 or 6 or 8. You know, is his house in order, as Carmen mentioned earlier? I mean, is there going to be a threat of retaliation? But it really kind of comes back to just basic business sense to start with, which is, you know, can you explain to the franchisor why this is a bad deal? It is the case, and we all hear it particularly in trial, that every franchisor trial lawyer in America stands up when they're in dispute and explains to the jury, why would we do anything to hurt this franchisee? Because if he goes out of business, we don't make any money. And you know, that rings true, because there is some truth to that. The franchisee needs to use that argument himself in that situation to make the point to the franchisor, look, you're going to imperil my business. And if you have to, you know, open up your books maybe a lot more than you'd like to explain it, then that's what you're going to have to do. Barring cooperation from the franchisor, no matter how good your argument is, at that point you better be talking to a franchisor lawyer who can help you find leverage. I tell almost every person that calls me that what we're trying to do for you is find leverage. Because if the franchisor is not willing to negotiate because it makes common sense to do so, you've got to create some risk for the franchisor in the franchisor-franchisee relationship. And I hate sort of taking this discussion that way, because this is about how you be successful as a franchisee and how you preserve and enhance the value of the business for your family and your employees' families, and really that's the mission statement, I think, of most good franchisee lawyers. We're trying to do that. But the reality is when the franchisor comes to you with that sort of a proposition, spend $2 million or else, then probably you can't think of something that imperils the value of your business more than an edict like that you have to comply with. So at that point, you start looking for the nooks and the crannies, and where can you find leverage to get the franchisor to be more reasonable with you.
And Carmen, as we close out this particular show, we've talked a lot about some of the struggles between the franchisor and the franchisee. Mm-hmm. But what we wanted to focus on as well is, how do you succeed as a franchise? You have dealt with lots and lots of franchises over your career and franchisees. And what's the hallmark of a successful franchisee? What is a common theme that you see time and time again that makes someone successful if they've purchased a franchise and want to operate this business long term?
That's an easy one, Chip. The people that I know, clients that have been the most successful, they work very hard, they pay attention to the details of their business, and they adhere to the brand and the operations manual, because they are good franchisees. And hopefully the franchisor is delivering its half of the promise and the bargain, so that everyone comes together. But there's not a substitute for hard work and paying attention to the details, just like any other business. And I think that kind of implies an important point that we should make here. Franchising is not an easy way to do business. It's not easier than starting your own business. You're kind of putting your chips on an established system that works, as Robert was describing, but you've still got to make it work in your location, in your outlet. It's not just going to happen automatically. The franchisor is not going to do the work for you, and the people have to understand that. It's not something that you can just phone it in from the golf course and make that franchise profitable. Then it becomes, as you grow, because the next thing you want to do, most people, one location is great to get started, but pretty soon you want to become a multi-unit operator and really have a nice organization. It's something that's going to generate a lot more revenue. Now you got to have a manager at each location. Now you got to be sure you hire the right people. And now you've got to be the better manager and all that. So it could be tremendously exciting. And the people that I've represented that have been successful, they are engaged, they're enthusiastic, and they're just really smart business people.
That certainly helps, no matter what you're trying to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Hard work and smart.
Yeah.
Well, that's all the time we have for the AAHOA Educational Experience this week. For Carmen Caruso and Ron Gardner and Robert Zarko, thank you, gentlemen, for being with us this week. We'll be back next week with more on franchising.